My son sold the roof over my head while I was still under it, trading 40 years of my breath for a digital currency that vanished before the ink on the deed was even dry. The air in Connecticut during late October has a specific way of settling into your bones. It is crisp, smelling of damp earth and the bittersweet rot of fallen maple leaves. I was on my knees in the garden of our Victorian home, my hands deep in the dark, cold soil of the flower beds. There is a meditative rhythm to planting tulip bulbs, a quiet promise you make to the earth that spring will eventually return, even if the winter feels like it might last forever. I was 65 years old, and in that moment, I felt like a permanent fixture of the landscape. I was the ghost of sacrifice, the woman who had spent 4 decades smoothing out the wrinkles in my family's life, making sure the tea was always hot and the burdens were always shared. I heard the gravel crunch under the tires of an expensive car. It was Julian, my son, the boy I had rocked to sleep in the very room he was currently plotting to liquidate. When he stepped out of the car, he wasn't the boy who used to help me weed these gardens. He was a man draped in a charcoal gray suit that cost more than my first mortgage, smelling of expensive cologne and the jittery electric scent of a man who lives his life through a high-speed internet connection. He looked at the house, not with the eyes of a son coming home, but with the strategic intelligence of a speculator assessing a materialistic asset. "Mom," he said, his voice clipped and efficient. He didn't bend down to hug me. He didn't even look at the garden. He was staring at a tablet in his hand, his thumb flicking across a screen filled with the erratic, jagged lines of a cryptocurrency market that seemed to be bleeding red. "We need to talk about the sublime transition we discussed, or rather the one I've had to accelerate." I stood up slowly, my knees popping with a sound like dry kindling. I wiped the dark Connecticut soil onto my apron, a garment that had seen more hard-working hours than Julian had seen in his entire 32 years. I felt a flicker of choking sorrow in the base of my throat, a premonition of the ultimate betrayal that was about to unfold. "Julian," I said, my voice adopting a quiet wisdom that he usually mistook for senility. "You look like a man who hasn't slept in 3 days. Come inside. I'll make some coffee." "There isn't time for coffee, Mom," he snapped, his disrespect flashing like a blade in the afternoon sun. "The market has been volatile. My Ethereum positions took a massive hit. I needed liquidity, and I needed it 48 hours ago. I've made a move. I've sold the house." The world didn't stop turning, but it felt as though the gravity had suddenly doubled. I looked at the wraparound porch, the hand-carved spindles, the oak front door that my late husband, Thomas, had refinished with his own hands 20 years ago. This wasn't just a building. It was the ancestry of brick and mortar. "You sold it?" I whispered. The choking sorrow was now a physical weight. "The buyer is a man named Marcus Vane, a developer. He's looking for high-yield turnarounds," Julian said, his delusions of power finally manifesting in his posture. He looked at me then, but his eyes were hollow, filled only with the digital mirage of the wealth he had lost. "The deal is closed. The funds have already been moved into a new hedge to recover my losses. You need to move out, Mom. The new owner will be here next week to take possession. I've already booked you a suite at a very efficient, very modern senior living community in the city. They have a 24-hour concierge. It's better this way. Better for whom, Julian? I asked. My voice was no longer fragmented. It was becoming firm and decisive. For everyone, he lied, checking his watch. This house is a liability. It's a relic of an archaic way of living. I'm doing you a favor, freeing you from the maintenance and the ancestry of debt. You'll thank me once the market rebounds. He handed me a glossy brochure for the senior center. It looked like a luxury hotel and felt like a prison. He saw me as a ghost of sacrifice, a woman who would simply nod, pack her memories into cardboard boxes, and vanish into the sublime silence of old age so he could continue his materialistic gamble. He thought that because I understood the soil, I didn't understand the law. He thought that because I was hardworking, I was easily displaced. As I stood there, soil still under my fingernails, I looked at my son and realized he had never truly known me. He had seen the humiliation of my aging, but he had never seen the strategic intelligence of my survival. And he forgot that I was the one who had handled the books for his father's engineering firm. He forgot that I was the one who had stood over the concrete pours of this very foundation, making sure the mixture was right so the house would stand for a century. Next week, Julian? I asked softly. Wednesday, noon, he replied, already turning back toward his car, his mind already miles away, chasing the next digital mirage. Don't make this difficult, Mom. It's a clean sale. Possession is immediate. I watched his car disappear down the tree-lined street. I looked back at my house. It looked peaceful, nestled in the autumn colors, unaware that it had been traded for a handful of digital dust. I felt the choking sorrow transform into something cold, sharp, and clinical. Julian thought he had sold the ground beneath my feet, and he didn't realize that 20 years ago I had ensured that the ground belonged to a ghost he couldn't see. I walked back to the garden and picked up my trowel. I didn't cry. I had 99 years of reasons not to. The humiliation was his, not mine. He just didn't know it yet. To understand why this house mattered, why I was willing to let my own son believe he had destroyed me just to save the ground I stood on, you have to understand the quiet wisdom of the woman who kept it. I am a child of the Great Depression's long, echoing shadow. My parents taught me that if you do not own the dirt beneath your fingernails, you are merely a ghost in someone else's play, waiting for the curtain to fall. When I married Thomas 40 years ago, we didn't just buy a house. We bought a sanctuary, a sublime fortress against a world that was becoming increasingly transactional. Thomas was a man of arrogance in his own right, though his was the constructive kind. He was a brilliant, loudmouth civil engineer who believed that the world could be conquered with a slide rule, a heavy hammer, and in a voice that could rattle the window panes. He was the roar of our life. I was the hum. He was the one who drew the blueprints, but I was the one who checked the materialistic costs of every beam and joist. I was the one who sat in the candlelight after he went to sleep, reading the fine print in every contract he signed with the city. I was the architect of our stability, the strategic intelligence that ensured the roof stayed over our heads when the storms of the economy tried to strip the shingles away. This house, a 3-story Victorian with wraparound porches and a heartbeat made of seasoned oak, was our shared masterpiece. I remember the summer of 1986 when we poured the foundation. I stood there, pregnant with Julian, my hand on the rough wooden forms, watching the gray slurry of concrete fill the trenches. Thomas shouted orders to the crew, his face flushed with the delusions of power that come with creation. But I was the one who noticed the mix was too dry. I was the one who stopped the pour until it was right. I knew even then that a house is only as strong as the truth of its base. Julian grew up in these halls, protected by the ghost of sacrifice I had become. I made sure his life was sublime and unburdened. I smoothed the path before him so thoroughly that he never learned the friction of hardworking reality. I gave him the best schools, the finest clothes, and a home that felt like an infinite resource. I thought I was giving him a foundation. I didn't realize I was feeding his disrespect for the physical world. Then came 2006, the year the roar went silent. Thomas died of a sudden, 'tis violent heart attack right in the foyer, his hand still clutching the brass doorknob of the house he thought he owned outright. Julian was 18 then, already possessed by a materialistic hunger that Thomas's success had inadvertently whetted. In the wake of the funeral, as the choking sorrow threatened to drown me, I saw a terrifying shift in my son. He didn't look at the Victorian as a legacy. He looked at it as a materialistic asset to be leveraged. He spoke of liquidity while the dirt on his father's grave was still fresh. He saw the house as an archaic burden, a pile of wood and stone that was preventing him from entering the digital mirage of high-stakes speculation. It was during those quiet, grieving hours of 2006 that I took a walk to the office of Mr. Abernathy, a very old, very discreet lawyer who understood the ancestry of law. I knew that one day Julian's arrogance would outrun his loyalty. I saw the vultures in his eyes before he even knew they were there. I realized that the boy I loved was also a man who would eventually sell his own history for a chance at a moonshot. Thomas left the house to you both in a complex trust, I told Abernathy, my voice firm and decisive. But Julian is the primary heir to the structure. He will have the deed, and he will sell it. I need a hidden weapon. I need to protect the foundation. Abernathy leaned back, his eyes full of quiet wisdom. You want to separate the bones from the skin, Eleanor? I want to own the ground, I said, and I want a lease that outlives me. That was the birth of Aegis Holdings, LLC, using the small, a private life insurance policy. Thomas had left specifically for me, money Julian never knew existed. I had Aegis purchase the land from the estate's holdings in a quiet, legal carve-out. Then, as the trustee of Thomas's estate, I signed the document that would become Julian's undoing, a 99-year lease agreement. I remember the smell of the ink that day, metallic and permanent. I was signing away my son's future, arrogance to save his mother's dignity. The rent was set at $1 a month. It was a legal truth buried in the public registry, waiting like a patient spider in a web of ancestry. Julian, in his haste to claim the deed and his delusions of power, never bothered to check the land registry for encumbrances. He saw the paper that said owner, and he assumed that meant he was the king. And he didn't realize that I had turned his kingdom into a leasehold. He didn't realize that while he was dreaming of digital dust, I had already secured the concrete. As I sat in the garden 20 years later, watching him walk away after telling me I was displaced, I felt the weight of that 2006 decision. It was a choking sorrow to know I had been right about my own son, but it was a sublime peace to know that the law protects those who are far-sighted. He thought he was moving fast and breaking things. He didn't realize that some things, like the ancestry of brick and a mother's quiet wisdom, are simply too heavy to break. Julian lived in a world of blue light and flickering numbers, a cold electric ghost realm where wealth had no weight, and a home was just a line of code waiting to be deleted. For the last decade, I watched my son vanish into a digital mirage. It started small, a few $100s in Bitcoin when it was a whisper among tech enthusiasts, but it grew into an obsession that consumed his quiet wisdom and replaced it with a frantic, materialistic hunger. He stopped looking at the trees in our yard and started looking at candlestick charts. He stopped valuing the ancestry of brick and began worshiping the sublime speed of decentralized finance. He would sit at my mahogany dining table, the same table where he used to do his long division with a pencil and an eraser, and surround himself with 3 different monitors. The room would be bathed in a sickly pale blue glow, making him look like a stranger, a creature of the machine. I would walk in with a tray of tea, the scent of Earl Grey and lemon clashing with the sterile heat of his processors, and he would look at me with a disrespect that was almost tender in its condescension. "You're working in a 3-dimensional world, Mom," he would say, his fingers flying across the keys with a strategic intelligence that was really just a sophisticated form of gambling. "It's slow, it's heavy. You worry about property taxes and roof leaks. In the DeFi space, we move at the speed of thought. I can flip an NFT and make more in 20 minutes than Dad made in a year of pouring concrete. Why do you cling to this pile of archaic wood?" "Because wood doesn't vanish when the power goes out." "Julian," I'd reply, sitting across from him with my checkbook. He would laugh then, a sharp metallic sound. "A checkbook? Really? You're still balancing a paper ledger? That's like using a sundial in a world of atomic clocks. You're sitting on $5 million of stagnant equity, Mom. If you'd let me leverage this house 5 years ago, if you'd let me put it into a high-yield liquidity pool, we wouldn't be talking about maintenance. We'd be talking about sovereignty." I would just smile and sip my tea, playing the part of the hardworking relic. I let him believe I was baffled by his talk of gas fees, cold wallets, and moonshots. I let him believe that his delusions of power were invisible to me. I was the architect of silence, and I knew that the sublime peaks of his digital world were always followed by choking sorrow in the valleys. But the market is a cruel mistress, and Julian was a man who didn't understand the weight of reality. He saw only the green lines of the ascent and ignored the red blood of the crash. Over the last year, the digital mirage began to shimmer and crack. The volatility he once praised as freedom became a materialistic noose. I watched his face grow sallow in the blue light. I saw the way his hand shook when he checked his phone at 3 a.m. His Ethereum venture wasn't a venture. It was a desperate, arrogant gamble to cover the losses of a dozen previous moonshots that had crashed into the sea. He had burned through his father's savings and the small inheritance I'd set aside for his wedding and his own reputation in the city. The only thing left was the house. He looked at the deed, the one he'd secured after Thomas died through a series of arrogant legal maneuvers I had pretended not to notice, and he saw his exit strategy. He thought he was the predator, the modern man outsmarting the archaic widow. He saw my Victorian home as a disputed asset in his own mind, a hurdle to be cleared so he could maintain his social status. He didn't realize that I had spent 20 years being far-sighted. He didn't realize that truth and honor don't need a blockchain to be immutable. "You don't understand the stakes, Mom," he had hissed just last month when I suggested we paint the shutters. "The shutters don't matter. Nothing in the physical world matters if you don't have the liquidity to stay in the game. You're obsessed with brick and mortar, while the world is moving to the cloud." "The cloud is just water vapor, Julian," I said softly. "Eventually, it has to rain. And when it does, you'll want a roof that doesn't flicker." He had walked away then, his disrespect absolute. He was so blinded by the digital mirage that he couldn't see the hidden weapon I had buried in the soil 20 years ago. He thought he was moving fast and breaking things. He didn't realize that the thing he was about to break, his mother's dignity, was made of the same reinforced concrete I had watched his father pour. As the red lines on his screen began to stay down, Julian's arrogance turned into a cold, desperate materialism. He stopped being a son and became a liquidator. He looked at me and saw an encumbrance. He looked at the house and saw digital dust. He was ready to sell his soul for one more shot at the mirage, never realizing that the law was a patient spider. And I was the one who had woven the web. The week leading up to my eviction was not a whirlwind of activity, but a slow, calculated masterclass in humiliation. Julian didn't just ask me to leave. He began to systematically erase the ancestry of brick and mortar that defined my existence. He treated my history like a clutter problem that needed a sublime digital solution. By Tuesday, the house I had breathed life into for 40 years felt like a stranger's gallery. Julian had brought in a team of professional stagers, men and women in sharp black turtlenecks, who moved through my rooms with the clinical detachment of coroners. They didn't see the quiet wisdom in my hand-carved mahogany sideboard, or the hard-working soul of the heavy wool rugs I'd spent years cleaning. They saw baggage. "It's about the vibe, Eleanor," one of them whispered, not even looking me in the eye as she draped a cold gray throw over the armchair where I had nursed Julian through the croup. "We need to strip the archaic personality to reveal the materialistic potential. The buyer needs a blank slate for his digital mirage." I watched as they boxed up the porcelain tea set Thomas had bought me in London. I felt a wave of choking sorrow as they removed the framed blueprints of this very house from the hallway, the ones Thomas had drawn with such arrogance and love. In their place, they hung abstract canvases of nothingness, splashes of void that cost thousands and felt like zero. The air no longer smelled of cinnamon and floor wax. It was replaced by a corporate spray called lavender and rain, a scent that smelled like expensive emptiness. "The buyer is a man named Marcus Vane," Julian said, leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen, his eyes glued to his flickering tablet. He didn't see me sitting at the small breakfast nook, my hands trembling as I held a chipped mug, the last piece of my old life they hadn't packed. "He's a hedge fund titan, Mom, a real mover. He doesn't just buy homes. He buys spatial assets. He's coming tomorrow at noon for the final walkthrough and to take possession." I looked at my son. His delusions of power were written in the way he held his shoulders, the way he looked at the ceiling as if calculating the square footage for a server farm. He had become a man of cold luxury, entirely divorced from the weight of reality. "And where am I to go, Julian?" I asked, my voice adopting a clear-headed, sharp tone that momentarily broke his concentration. He didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rectangular piece of white plastic. It looked like a credit card, but it had a small glowing blue LED in the corner. He slid it across the table toward me. It clattered against the wood, a hollow, digital sound. "The smart key," he said, his voice dripping with a manufactured sublime kindness. "It's for the suite at the Meridian. I've already had your essentials moved there. It's the ultimate in efficient living. No stairs, no lawn, no ancestry of debt. You just tap the card against the sensor. It's the future, Mom. No more heavy brass keys to lose." I picked up the card. It felt light, insultingly light. It was a piece of plastic intended to replace 4 decades of heavy, honest metal. To Julian, this was an upgrade. To me, it was the ultimate displacement. He thought he had locked me out of my own life by changing the hardware. He thought that by controlling the smart system, he controlled the truth. "Marcus is very thorough," Julian continued, checking his watch, the gold glinting in the pale October sun. "He's already had the smart key system installed here, too. I gave him the master code this morning. As of tomorrow at noon, your old keys won't even turn the locks. It's a clean break, Mom. Move fast and break things, remember? That's how we win." "You've certainly broken things, Julian," I said softly, my thumb tracing the edge of the plastic card. "It's just a house, Eleanor," he snapped, his disrespect finally bubbling to the surface. "It's a pile of depreciating wood. The Meridian is a sovereign move. You're 65. You should be happy someone is taking this liability off your hands." I stood up, the choking sorrow in my chest hardening into a cold, diamond-sharp, strategic intelligence. I looked around the sterilized living room at the gray throws and the splashes of void. Julian thought he had won because he had the code. He thought he had outsmarted the archaic widow because he knew how to navigate a digital mirage. He forgot one thing. He forgot that codes are just layers on top of the foundation, and I was the one who knew the hidden weapon buried in the very dirt Marcus Vane was so eager to pave over. "Wednesday at noon," I whispered. "Noon sharp," Julian replied, already turning back to his screen, his mind already miles away, chasing the next green line on his chart. I walked to the kitchen and looked at the underside of the pantry shelf, where my manila envelope was still taped. Julian hadn't found it. The stagers hadn't found it. They were too busy looking at the vibe to notice the legal truth. I felt the weight of the 99-year lease calling to me. Julian had the smart key, but I had the shield. And tomorrow, the hedge fund titan was going to learn that in the world of truth and honor, plastic cards don't mean a thing when you're standing on someone else's land. Tuesday night was a hollow, echoing canyon of a time. The house, which had once breathed with the warmth of 4 decades of life, had been reduced to a spatial contrast of what it once was. It was empty of my soul, yet cluttered with the cold luxury of Julian's stagers. The moonlight, usually a comforting silver glow through the oak branches, now felt like a cold, clinical spotlight hitting the gray cashmere throws and the abstract splashes of void that hung where my family's history used to be. I sat on the floor of the living room, the actual floor, because the furniture they'd left was too sleek, too sublime, and too uncomfortable for a woman with my history. My back was pressed against the baseboard, and for the first hour I did nothing but listen to the silence. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a sleeping home. It was the aggressive, sterile silence of a gallery. The air no longer carried the scent of the cinnamon rolls I'd baked for Julian's every birthday. It was heavy with that lavender and rain chemical spray, a scent that felt like a materialistic attempt to bleach away the past. I wept. The choking sorrow was so profound. It felt like I was drowning in the very air I had breathed for 40 years. I wept for Thomas, the man of arrogance and engineering, who had loved this house as much as he loved his own heartbeat. I wept for Julian, the boy I had raised to be a man of truth and honor, only to watch him become a creature of the digital mirage, a stranger who saw his own mother as an encumbrance to be cleared away. But mostly I wept for the ghost of sacrifice I had allowed myself to become. And I had played the part of the hardworking relic so convincingly that even my own flesh and blood believed I was a victim. I had smoothed the path for Julian so thoroughly that he had never learned to look at the ground. He only looked at the horizon, chasing the next green line on his glowing screens. I had been the silent hum in the background of his life, and now that hum was being silenced by a smart key and a hedge fund titan. "Is this how it ends?" I whispered to the empty room. "Do the vultures really win just because they move faster?" I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the wall. And then I felt it. It was a low, steady vibration coming through the floorboards. It was the furnace in the basement, a massive iron beast that I had maintained with my own hands every winter since Thomas passed. I knew every belt, every filter, every eccentric rattle of that machine. It was a rhythmic pulse, a reminder of the ancestry of brick and mortar that Julian so easily dismissed. This house wasn't just wood and stone. It was a living covenant. It was a legal truth built on top of a foundation I had personally supervised. I opened my eyes. The choking sorrow didn't vanish, but it began to crystallize. It turned from a liquid grief into a diamond-sharp strategic intelligence. I realized that I wasn't just a resident. I was the architect. Julian thought he had displaced me because he had the deed and the technology. He thought his delusions of power were backed by the ultimate authority. He didn't realize that the law is a patient spider, and I was the one who had woven the web 20 years ago. I stood up. My knees ached. A sharp reminder of the hard-working life I had led, but my spine was a rod of cold rolled steel. I walked toward the kitchen, my footsteps echoing on the oak floors that Julian had already sold to Marcus Vane. I didn't need the smart key he'd given me. I didn't need his permission. I entered the pantry. The stagers had cleared out my spices, my jars, and my mismatched plates, replacing them with sublime glass canisters filled with decorative uncooked pasta. They were looking for the vibe, but they had missed the history. I reached into the very back of the bottom shelf behind a heavy jar of flour that they hadn't moved because it was too archaic and heavy for their aesthetic. My fingers touched the underside of the wooden shelf. I felt the familiar texture of the duct tape I'd placed there in 2006. With a firm pull, and the tape gave way, and a thick yellowed manila envelope fell into my hands. It was my hidden weapon. I sat at the small built-in breakfast nook, the only piece of furniture that couldn't be moved, and opened the envelope. The paper inside was crisp, the ink a dark, permanent testament to a mother's far-sighted love and a widow's strategic intelligence. There it was, the 99-year lease agreement between the estate of Thomas Sullivan and Aegis Holdings, LLC. I looked at my signature. It was firm. It was decisive. It was the signature of a woman who knew that the digital mirage would eventually reign, and that when it did, she would need a roof that didn't flicker. "You thought I was the ghost of sacrifice, Julian," I whispered, my voice now a clear-headed, sharp tone that cut through the chemical scent of the room. "But tomorrow, you and Mr. Vane are going to find out that I am the landlord." I tucked the envelope into my apron pocket. The weight of displacement was gone, replaced by the weight of the ancestry of law. I walked back into the living room and looked at the abstract splashes of void on the walls. They didn't frighten me anymore. Tomorrow at noon, the vultures would land expecting a feast. Instead, they would find a fortress. I sat back down on the floor, but this time I didn't weep. I leaned against the brick and mortar, closed my eyes, and waited for the sun to rise on my 99 years of peace. What is the one thing you've built so well that even your own mistakes can't tear it down? Midnight in a house that is no longer your own has a sound like held breath. The blue LED on the smart key Julian left on the counter pulsed with a rhythmic synthetic heartbeat, casting a cold indigo glow across the kitchen. It was the only light in the room, a digital eye watching me, waiting for me to surrender. But I wasn't looking at the key. I was looking at the yellowed pages spread out before me on the breakfast nook, the ink of 2006 still sharp and defiant against the paper. To understand the strategic intelligence of this moment, you have to understand the specific type of arrogance that blinded my son. Julian believed that because I didn't understand Ethereum gas fees, I didn't understand power. He thought that because I preferred a paper ledger to a cloud-based wallet, I was a hard-working relic of a bygone era. He mistook my silence for a lack of a plan. He never realized that while he was chasing a digital mirage, I was mastering the ancestry of law. The seeds of this secret covenant were sown the week after Thomas's funeral. Julian was 18, and even through the haze of my own choking sorrow, I saw it. I saw him standing in the foyer of this Victorian, not grieving, but measuring. He was looking at the crown molding and the stained glass not as a legacy, but as a liquidity event. He was already talking about exit strategies before his father's estate was even out of probate. That was when I called Mr. Abernathy. Thomas left the house to the family trust, I told him in his wood-paneled office that smelled of old paper and tobacco. But Julian is the sole trustee once he turns 25. He's going to sell it, Abernathy. I can see the hunger in his eyes. He'll sell the porch I sat on, the garden I planted, and the roof that kept him safe, all for a chance to play a bigger game. Abernathy had nodded, his quiet wisdom matching my own. The law is a tool, Eleanor. In the wrong hands, it's a wrecking ball. In the right hands, it's a fortress. That was the day we created Aegis Holdings, LLC. Using the $50,000 life insurance policy Thomas had privately tucked away for me. money Julian didn't even know existed because it wasn't part of the public estate. Aegis Holdings purchased the land beneath the Victorian. It was a quiet, legal carve-out, a separation of the freehold, the structure, from the land. Then, as the acting executrix of the estate, I signed the document that would become my hidden weapon. I granted Aegis Holdings a 99-year lease agreement for the right to occupy the land. The terms were a masterpiece of far-sighted protection. The rent, fixed at $1 per month for the duration of the term. Prepayment, the lease allowed for the full 99 years of rent, $1,188, to be paid up front, which I did immediately. Possession, the leaseholder, Aegis, and by extension me, held exclusive right of possession of the structure and all improvements on the land. Transferability, the lease was an encumbrance that attached to the property. Any future owner of the house bought it subject to this lease. Julian, in his materialistic haste to claim the deed when he turned 25, never performed a title search on the land, and he saw owner on the county tax records for the building and assumed that meant he was the sovereign. He was so distracted by the sublime potential of the equity that he never looked at the fine print of the dirt. He thought he had inherited a $5 million asset. He didn't realize he had inherited a house that already had a tenant with a century-long prepaid contract. I sat there in the indigo light, my thumb tracing the embossed seal of the notary. This wasn't a sham transaction. It was a legitimate recorded legal instrument. I had been the ghost of sacrifice for 20 years, paying the utilities, maintaining the slate roof, and keeping the boiler hummed, all while Julian mocked my archaic attachment to the physical world. I let him believe I was a victim of my own sentimentality. And I let him believe that he was moving fast and breaking things, while I was just standing still. But the law is a patient spider. Julian's Ethereum venture had collapsed, and he had sold this house to Marcus Vane to cover his digital mirage of a life. He had promised Vane a clear title and immediate possession. He had sold a $5 million Victorian for a fraction of its worth because he was desperate. He thought he was clearing me out like an old piece of furniture. He didn't know that the smart key he'd installed was useless. He didn't know that Marcus Vane hadn't bought a home. He had bought a legal nightmare. I stood up, the ache in my knees a familiar, hard-working companion. I tucked the papers back into the manila envelope and slid it into my apron pocket. I looked at the indigo pulse of the smart key one last time. "You were so busy looking at the moon, Julian," I whispered to the empty lavender-scented air, "that you forgot to check if you actually owned the ground you were standing on." The turning point was only 12 hours away. Tomorrow at noon, the vultures would land. They would bring their lawyers, their moving trucks, and their cold luxury. And they would find a 65-year-old woman sitting on her porch with a cup of tea and a 99-year reason why she wasn't moving an inch. Reflection. Wealth is not what you can sell. It is what you can protect. In a world that prizes the digital mirage of speed and exit strategies, the most strategic intelligence lies in the enduring. We are often told that to win, we must be aggressive, but the true sublime victory belongs to the one who is far-sighted. Don't be afraid to be the ghost in your own story, if it means you are the one who poured the concrete. The smart keys of the world may change the locks, but they can never change the truth and honor of a well-crafted foundation. Tomorrow I rise, not in anger, but in dignity. The lease is signed, the rent is paid, and the house is finally, truly home. Midnight in a house that is no longer your own has a sound like held breath. The blue LED on the smart key Julian left on the counter pulsed with a rhythmic synthetic heartbeat, casting a cold indigo glow across the kitchen. It was the only light in the room, a digital eye watching me, waiting for me to surrender. But I wasn't looking at the key. I was looking at the yellowed pages spread out before me on the breakfast nook, the ink of 2006 still sharp and defiant against the paper. To understand the strategic intelligence of this moment, you have to understand the specific type of arrogance that blinded my son. Julian believed that because I didn't understand Ethereum gas fees, I didn't understand power. He thought that because I preferred a paper ledger to a cloud-based wallet, I was a hard-working relic of a bygone era. He mistook my silence for a lack of a plan. He never realized that while he was chasing a digital mirage, I was mastering the ancestry of law. The seeds of this secret covenant were sown the week after Thomas's funeral. Julian was 18, and even through the haze of my own choking sorrow, I saw it. I saw him standing in the foyer of this Victorian, not grieving, but measuring. He was looking at the crown molding and the stained glass not as a legacy, but as a liquidity event. He was already talking about exit strategies before his father's estate was even out of probate. That was when I called Mr. Abernathy. Thomas left the house to the family trust, I told him in his wood-paneled office that smelled of old paper and tobacco. But Julian is the sole trustee once he turns 25. He's going to sell at Abernathy. I can see the hunger in his eyes. He'll sell the porch I sat on, the garden I planted, and the roof that kept him safe, all for a chance to play a bigger game. Abernathy had nodded, his quiet wisdom matching my own. The law is a tool, Eleanor. In the wrong hands, it's a wrecking ball. In the right hands, it's a fortress. That was the day we created Aegis Holdings, LLC. Using the $50,000 life insurance policy Thomas had privately tucked away for me. Money Julian didn't even know existed because it wasn't part of the public estate. Aegis Holdings purchased the land beneath the Victorian. It was a quiet, legal carve-out, a separation of the freehold, the structure, from the land. Then, as the acting executrix of the estate, I signed the document that would become my hidden weapon. I granted Aegis Holdings a 99-year lease agreement for the right to occupy the land. The terms were a masterpiece of far-sighted protection. The rent, fixed at $1 per month for the duration of the term. Prepayment, the lease allowed for the full 99 years of rent, $1,188, to be paid up front, which I did immediately. Possession, the leaseholder, Aegis, and by extension me, held exclusive right of possession of the structure and all improvements on the land. Transferability, the lease was an encumbrance that attached to the property. Any future owner of the house bought it subject to this lease. Julian, in his materialistic haste to claim the deed when he turned 25, never performed a title search on the land, and he saw owner on the county tax records for the building and assumed that meant he was the sovereign. He was so distracted by the sublime potential of the equity that he never looked at the fine print of the dirt. He thought he had inherited a $5 million asset. He didn't realize he had inherited a house that already had a tenant with a century-long prepaid contract. I sat there in the indigo light, my thumb tracing the embossed seal of the notary. This wasn't a sham transaction. It was a legitimate recorded legal instrument. I had been the ghost of sacrifice for 20 years, paying the utilities, maintaining the slate roof, and keeping the boiler hummed, all while Julian mocked my archaic attachment to the physical world. I let him believe I was a victim of my own sentimentality. And I let him believe that he was moving fast and breaking things, while I was just standing still. But the law is a patient spider. Julian's Ethereum venture had collapsed, and he had sold this house to Marcus Vane to cover his digital mirage of a life. He had promised Vane a clear title and immediate possession. He had sold a $5 million Victorian for a fraction of its worth because he was desperate. He thought he was clearing me out like an old piece of furniture. He didn't know that the smart key he'd installed was useless. He didn't know that Marcus Vane hadn't bought a home. He had bought a legal nightmare. I stood up, the ache in my knees a familiar, hard-working companion. I tucked the papers back into the manila envelope and slid it into my apron pocket. I looked at the indigo pulse of the smart key one last time. "You were so busy looking at the moon, Julian," I whispered to the empty lavender-scented air, "that you forgot to check if you actually owned the ground you were standing on." The turning point was only 12 hours away. Tomorrow at noon, the vultures would land. They would bring their lawyers, their moving trucks, and their cold luxury. And they would find a 65-year-old woman sitting on her porch with a cup of tea and a 99-year reason why she wasn't moving an inch. Reflection. Wealth is not what you can sell. It is what you can protect. In a world that prizes the digital mirage of speed and exit strategies, the most strategic intelligence lies in the enduring. We are often told that to win, we must be aggressive, but the true sublime victory belongs to the one who is far-sighted. Don't be afraid to be the ghost in your own story, if it means you are the one who poured the concrete. The smart keys of the world may change the locks, but they can never change the truth and honor of a well-crafted foundation. Tomorrow I rise, not in anger, but in dignity. The lease is signed, the rent is paid, and the house is finally, truly home. Marcus Vane's face transformed from the polished mask of cold luxury to a map of jagged, materialistic fury in less than 6 seconds. The man was a predator of the markets. He knew how to read a spreadsheet, and he certainly knew how to read a death warrant for his investment. As his eyes tore through the pages of the 99-year lease agreement, the silence on the porch became so heavy it felt like the wood was groaning under the weight of it. Julian stood beside him, his mouth slightly open, his delusions of power flickering like a dying bulb in a storm. He still didn't understand the strategic intelligence of the woman sitting in the rocking chair. "Julian," Vane whispered, his voice vibrating with a low, dangerous frequency. "What is this?" It's just some old papers, Marcus," Julian stammered, reaching out with a hand that shook so violently he nearly knocked the envelope to the floor. "My mother is being archaic. She's confused. I have the deed. I have the clear title from the probate court. You have a title to a pile of sticks, you idiot, Vane roared, the arrogance of the Titan finally shattering into 1,000 pieces. He shoved the document into Julian's chest. Look at the land registry date, 2006. This encumbrance was recorded 20 years ago. Aegis Holdings owns a leasehold on the ground that survives any transfer of the freehold. You sold me a house I can't set foot in for the next 80 years. I took another sip of my tea, the steam warming my face. I watched my son, the man of the digital mirage, fumble with the physical reality of the law. He looked at the paper, his eyes darting across the terms I had memorized long ago. Exclusive possession, $1 per month, prepaid in full. Aegis Holdings, Julian breathed, the name finally sounding familiar in the dark recesses of his memory. Mom. Aegis was the name of the security firm Dad used for the engineering office. You made a shell company? I made a shield, Julian, I said, my voice adopting a clear-headed, sharp tone that cut through his panic. I saw your materialistic hunger the day we buried your father. I knew that your arrogance would eventually lead you to treat this home like a chip in a poker game. So I separated the bones from the skin. You owned the structure. But I, through Aegis, owned the right to occupy the ground it stands on. And in this state, the ground right dictates the use of the structure. Marcus Vane turned back to me, his cold luxury replaced by a desperate, calculating hunger. Mrs. Sullivan, I am a man of business. Whatever Aegis wants to break this lease, I'll double it. 500,000? $1 million? You can buy 3 sublime penthouses in the city for that. I looked at him, this man who thought every truth and honor had a price tag. Mr. Vane, you see liquidity where I see life. You see a spatial asset to be gutted. I see the kitchen where I taught my son to be a man, a lesson he clearly failed. No amount of your digital dust can buy the 99 years of peace I've already paid for. This is fraudulent sale, Julian, Vane screamed, turning his fury back onto my son. You signed a warranty deed. You swore there were no superior interests. My legal team will strip you of every Ethereum cent you have left. I'll sue you for the purchase price, the damages, and the sublime costs of my lost time. You're finished. Julian collapsed onto the porch steps, his charcoal suit finally looking like the cheap armor it was. The choking sorrow I felt for him was there, but it was distant, like a storm passing over another valley. I had tried to teach him the ancestry of brick and mortar, but he had chosen the digital mirage. He had tried to discard me like a piece of archaic furniture, and in his disrespect, he had walked straight into a trap I had set 20 years ago. The car for the city is still at the curb, Julian, I said softly. The rhythmic creak of my rocking chair, the only calm sound left. Perhaps you should take it. I imagine, mister. Vane's lawyers will be looking for you shortly, and you'll want to be somewhere efficient when they arrive. Vane didn't wait. He was already on his phone, his voice a series of barks to his legal department, his materialistic world collapsing into a black hole of litigation. He retreated to his black SUV, the vehicle of cold luxury, now a getaway car for a man who had been outsmarted by a gardening apron. Julian looked up at me, his face a mask of ruined arrogance. You ruined me, Mom. You let me sell it just to trap me. No, Julian, I said, looking out at the crimson maples. You ruined yourself the moment you decided a home was a transaction and your mother was a liability. The law doesn't care about your vibe or your exit strategy. The law protects those who are far-sighted. I didn't trap you. I simply stayed where I belonged. As the SUV screeched out of the driveway, followed by the car Julian had intended for my eviction, the silence returned to the Victorian. The lavender and rain scent was fading, replaced by the honest smell of the October earth. I was 65 years old. I was a widow, and I was the managing director of my own destiny. The vultures had landed, and they had found the concrete was much harder than they imagined. Reflection. Hubris is the belief that the new always trumps the old, that the smart key is more powerful than the lease. But in the architecture of a life, the ancestry of law is the only thing that holds the roof up when the digital mirage evaporates. Never mistake a woman's quiet wisdom for weakness. She isn't just watching the garden grow. She's watching the foundation. And sometimes the most sublime victory is simply refusing to move. The following 3 months were a masterclass in strategic intelligence, played out through the cold medium of registered mail and frantic court filings. The black SUV was long gone, but its shadow remained in the form of a legal siege that would have leveled a skyscraper, let alone a Victorian home. Marcus Vane didn't just walk away. He did what men of cold luxury do when they realize they've been outplayed. He unleashed a fleet of lawyers with the explicit instruction to burn everything Julian had ever touched. I sat on my wraparound porch every morning, the rhythmic creak of the rocking chair a steady pulse against the frantic pings of Julian's collapsing world. From my vantage point, I watched the couriers arrive. They didn't come in sleek vehicles anymore. They came in battered sedans, serving papers that looked like the dry, white bones of Julian's digital mirage. Vane was suing for fraudulent sale, breach of warranty, and intentional misrepresentation. He wasn't just looking for his money back. He was looking for blood. The siege of the sham Vane's legal team, led by a man whose voice sounded like crushed gravel, didn't waste time attacking the structure of the house. They went straight for the ground. They filed a motion to vacate the 99-year lease, labeling it a sham transaction designed to defraud future creditors. They argued that Aegis Holdings, LLC, was an alter ego for Eleanor Sullivan, a shell created with no purpose other than to cloud the title and strip the property of its materialistic value. I remember the day the deposition request arrived. I was in the kitchen, and the air once again smelling of cinnamon and floor wax, the chemical lavender and rain spray having finally been scrubbed away. Julian was in the foyer, his charcoal suit looking frayed, his eyes wide with a choking sorrow he was only just beginning to name. "They're going to break it, Mom," he whispered, holding the summons like a death warrant. "Vane has 100 lawyers. You're just one woman with an old manila envelope. They're calling the lease a fraudulent conveyance. They say no rational person signs a century-long lease for $1 a month. They're going to prove you're a ghost of sacrifice who overstepped." I wiped my hands on my apron and looked at him. "Julian, a rational person in their world, is a man who bets his mother's home on a line of code. And in the world of truth and honor, a rational person is one who ensures the foundation is poured deep enough to withstand the wind." the ancestry of documentation. What Vane's lawyers didn't count on was the quiet wisdom of 2006. They thought they were dealing with a spontaneous act of desperation. They didn't realize that the law is a patient spider, and I had been weaving this web for 2 decades. When the time came to provide discovery, I didn't send emails or digital files. I sent boxes, the check stubs, canceled checks from Aegis Holdings to the estate of Thomas Sullivan, showing the market value purchase of the land rights in 2006. The tax records, 20 years of property tax payments made by Aegis for the land, separate from the structure's taxes. The prepayment ledger, a notarized receipt of the $1,188 prepaid rent, dated and recorded before Julian ever held the deed. The correspondence, letters from Mr. Abernathy discussing the strategic intelligence of land separation to protect the family from market volatility. I had been far-sighted enough to know that a sham is something built in a day. A covenant is something built over a lifetime. Every time they tried to find a gap in the armor, they found another layer of hard-working reality. They were looking for a digital mirage they could delete. They found brick-and-mortar law that refused to budge. The turning point. The legal battle reached its crescendo in a sterile, wood-paneled courtroom in downtown Hartford. Marcus Vane sat at the plaintiff's table, his arrogance now a cold, simmering rage. Julian sat behind him, a spectator at the funeral of his own ambition. Vane's lead counsel stood before the judge, a woman of quiet wisdom, who looked like she'd seen 1,000 titans crumble. "Your Honor," he argued, "this lease is a relic of archaic thinking. It's an encumbrance that renders a $5 million asset worthless. It was designed to trap my client." The judge looked at the yellowed pages of my 2006 lease. She looked at the signatures. Then she looked at Marcus Vane. "Mr. Vane," she said, her voice a calm, elegant weight in the room, "the law does not exist to protect you from your own lack of due diligence. This lease was recorded in the public registry 20 years ago. It was not hidden. It was ignored. You purchased a structure sitting on land that had already been spoken for. And the ancestry of law is very clear. A buyer takes the property subject to all visible and recorded interests." She turned her gaze to Julian, then back to the papers. "The court finds no evidence of fraudulent conveyance. What I find is a mother who was far-sighted enough to value a home over a transaction. The motion to vacate is denied. Mrs. Sullivan's lease is valid, prepaid, and ironclad until the year 2105. The reflection of the web. As we walked out of the courtroom, Marcus Vane didn't even look at us. He was already barking into his phone about the fraudulent sale lawsuit he was pursuing against Julian. My son stood on the courthouse steps, the autumn wind whipping his tie. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, the disrespect was gone. It was replaced by a terrifying, hollow realization. "You knew," he said. "You knew the market would rain." "I didn't know when it would rain, Julian," I said, adjusting my scarf. "I just knew that a digital mirage doesn't come with a gutter system. I stayed in the dirt so you could have a place to land when you finally fell from the clouds." The law had finished its work. The spider had caught the vultures. As I drove back to my Victorian, I felt the dignity rise in my chest, like a morning sun. I was going home, And for the next 80 years, the only thing that would be moving fast in my house was the wind through the maple trees. The lesson: the smart keys of the world are only as good as the electricity that powers them. But the fine print of a mother's love, that is written in the permanent ink of the earth itself. The digital mirage did not just fade. It evaporated, leaving behind a scorched earth of litigation and a son who looked like he had been hollowed out from the inside. A week before the final restitution hearings, Julian came to the house, my house, one last time. He didn't pull into the driveway with the arrogance of a titan. He arrived in a battered silver subcompact rental that buzzed like an angry insect against the ancestry of brick and mortar. When he stepped out, the cold luxury was gone. The charcoal suit was replaced by a fraying sweater and jeans that hung loose on a frame that had forgotten how to eat. He didn't look like a hedge fund titan anymore. He looked like the boy who used to skin his knees on this very driveway, but without the mother to kiss them better. He stopped at the edge of the lawn. It was a physical manifestation of his new reality. He didn't dare step onto the porch. He stood in the dirt, the very dirt he had ignored for 20 years, looking up at me as I sat in my rocking chair. The Connecticut wind was turning colder now, whispering through the eaves, but the house stood as it always had, firm and decisive. "Why, Mom?" he asked. His voice was no longer the sharp, electric hum of a man moving at the speed of thought. It was thin, brittle, and laden with a choking sorrow that he was finally, painfully forced to own. "Why didn't you just tell me? Why let me go this far? You watched me sign the papers with Vane. You watched me burn every bridge I had. Why keep the secret covenant until the very second it would destroy me?" I set my tea down on the wicker side table. I looked at my son, and for a moment I felt the old ghost of sacrifice stir in my chest, wanting to reach out and smooth the path. But I held my ground. The strategic intelligence of a mother's love is sometimes the hardest thing to wield. "I tried to tell you for 20 years, Julian," I said, my voice elegant and unyielding. "I tried to show you the value of the ancestry of brick. I tried to teach you that truth and honor are the only real assets in a world that can disappear when the power goes out. Every time I balanced my paper ledger, every time I spoke of the roof or the foundation, I was trying to show you the floor, but you wouldn't listen. You saw me as a hard-working relic you could discard. You saw this home as liquidity. You were so busy looking at the sublime peaks of your digital charts that you forgot that every peak has a base." "I was just trying to win," he whispered, his eyes fixed on his own shadows on the grass. "You were trying to win at a game that doesn't exist, Julian," I replied. "You were chasing a digital mirage and selling your soul for liquidity. You forgot that the law protects those who are far-sighted. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to protect the foundation. If I had just handed you the deed without the shield of the land lease, you would have lost this house 10 years ago to some other vulture. You would have had nowhere to land when the wind changed." The weight of reality hit him then. He looked at the Victorian, the wraparound porch, the solid oak beams, and the 99 years of peace he had tried to trade for a week of digital sovereignty. He realized that I hadn't trapped him. I had provided the only solid thing in his life, and he had tried to pave it over. The final hearings were a legal chessboard of accountability. Julian was not sentenced to a prison cell, but to a restitution plan that would take him a lifetime to complete. He was stripped of his digital assets, his licenses, and his social status. The judge ordered 2,000 hours of community service, working for the very city infrastructure his father had once engineered. He would be the one fixing the pipes, the one ensuring the concrete was poured correctly. He would learn the hard-working truth of the physical world, 1 hour at a time. He moved into a small, efficient apartment on the edge of the city, and it was a bitter irony. It was exactly the kind of modern living he had planned for me. It had no stairs, no lawn, and no ancestry. It was a box of white drywall and linoleum, a place where he would have to learn the price of a gallon of milk and the value of an honest dollar. He was no longer a titan. He was a man who had to rebuild the concrete. As I watched him drive away that final day, the subcompact car disappearing into the autumn mist, I didn't feel the humiliation he had tried to heap upon me. I felt the dignity rise of a woman who had saved her son's life by letting him lose his world. He had fallen like Icarus, his digital wings melted by the sun of his own arrogance. But I had ensured he landed in the dirt, my dirt, and dirt is the only place where things can grow back. The cold luxury was gone, and the digital mirage had settled into the ancestry of brick. I walked back into my kitchen, the air once again smelling of cinnamon and resilience, and I realized that being far-sighted isn't about seeing the future. It's about ensuring the present has a place to stand. My son was diminished, but for the first time in his life, he was real. And in the world of truth and honor, that is the only sublime victory that matters. The silence that followed the courtroom victory was not the hollow, ringing silence of the stager's era. It was the deep, resonant quiet of a house that had finally been allowed to stop holding its breath. The legal vultures had scattered back to their glass towers, and the black SUV was a fading memory in the gravel of my driveway. For the first time in months, the air in the Victorian didn't smell like lavender and rain, or the metallic tang of Julian's digital mirage. It smelled of damp earth, seasoned oak, and the slow, steady approach of winter. My first act as the undisputed sovereign of the land was a physical purge of the cold luxury that had tried to colonize my life. I didn't use a smart key or a digital interface to clear the house. I hired Silas and his son, two local men with calloused hands and a deep respect for the ancestry of brick and mortar. I watched with a firm and decisive satisfaction as they carried out the abstract splashes of nothingness, those voids of color that had cost Marcus Vane a fortune and had cost me my peace. "Where to, Mrs. Sullivan?" Silas asked, gesturing to a particularly large, soulless canvas of gray and white. "To the charity shop, Silas," I replied, standing on the porch with my hands tucked into the pockets of my denim apron. Perhaps someone who hasn't yet found their own strategic intelligence will find value in them. In this house, we are returning to things with weight. We brought my life back out of the basement and the storage units. The mahogany sideboard, heavy with the history of 1,000 Sunday dinners, was returned to its place of honor. And the family photos, the ones Julian had labeled baggage, were returned to the mantel. I spent hours polishing the silver, the repetitive, hard-working motion, a kind of prayer. As the truth and honor of my own history began to fill the rooms again, the house seemed to expand, its joints settling with a contented groan. The restoration wasn't just about the furniture, it was about the soil. I returned to my garden as the first frost began to rim the maple leaves in silver. The ground was hard, resisting the trowel, but I found a quiet wisdom in the struggle. I knelt in the dirt, my knees aching, a familiar honest pain, and finished planting the last of the tulip bulbs. I looked at those small, papery orbs in my palm. They were the ultimate strategists. They were currently being buried in the dark, facing a winter they couldn't control, yet they were far-sighted. They weren't chasing a digital mirage of immediate growth. They were anchoring themselves, storing energy, and waiting for a spring they couldn't yet see. They were protected by the very earth that Julian had tried to sell. "Is this the sublime victory?" I whispered to the freezing soil. To be like the bulb, buried but not broken, waiting for the law of nature to take its course. I realized then that I was no longer the ghost of sacrifice. I had spent 40 years believing that my role was to be the fuel for other people's ambitions. Thomas's engineering firm, Julian's education, the family's social standing. I had played the part of the archaic widow so well that I had almost forgotten I was the one who had poured the concrete. But the 99-year lease had changed the architecture of my soul. I wasn't a victim of displacement. I was the architect of my own solitude. I had used the law not as a weapon of malice, but as a shield of dignity. I had stood my ground against a hedge fund titan and a prodigal son, not with arrogance, but with the quiet wisdom of someone who knows that the fine print is where the truth lives. The house was no longer just a structure. It was a testimony to the power of being far-sighted. As evening fell, I sat on the wraparound porch in my old rocking chair. The stager's decorative candles had been replaced by the honest glow of the porch light, illuminating the crimson maples that stood like sentinels around my land. The smart key sat on the side table, its blue LED finally dead, a useless piece of plastic in a world of brick and mortar. I felt a profound sense of peace, a sublime solitude that didn't feel lonely. It felt like sovereignty. I had 99 years, or at least the 80 I had prepaid for, to watch the seasons turn. I had outlasted the market, the vultures, and the digital mirage. I had stayed in the dirt, and because of that, I was the only one who truly owned the sky above it. I took a deep breath of the cold Connecticut air. It smelled of wood smoke and resilience. I was Ellender Sullivan, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't living for the next generation's exit strategy. I was living for the ancestry of the present. The garden was tucked in, the house was restored, and the dignity rise was complete. I was home. And as the law was my witness, I wasn't moving an inch. The blue LED on the smart key Julian gave me has finally flickered out, its battery exhausted, its digital promise unfulfilled. It sits on my mahogany end table now, nothing more than a hollow piece of plastic, a 5-cent souvenir of a $5 million delusion. Outside, the Connecticut spring of 2026 is waking up the maples I planted with Thomas 40 years ago. The world continues to chase the digital mirage, but here, inside these Victorian walls, the air is thick with the scent of beeswax, old books, and the absolute unshakable certainty of the dirt. I often sit in my rocking chair as the sun dips behind the ridge, reflecting on the Dignity Rise formula that brought me back to myself. My son, currently navigating the hardworking reality of a court-mandated restitution plan, recently sent me a letter. It wasn't written on a glowing screen or sent via an encrypted app. It was on a piece of lined notebook paper, smudged with the kind of grease you can only get from working on real-world infrastructure. He's learning that you can't exit strategy your way out of a broken water main. He's learning that the ancestry of brick requires a different kind of strategic intelligence, the architecture of farsightedness. People often ask me if I feel guilty for trapping my own son. To them, I say this: a mother's love is not a floor mat. It is a foundation. If I had allowed Julian to succeed in his materialistic betrayal, he would have learned that people are disposable and that truth and honor are secondary to liquidity. By unsheathing the 99-year lease, I didn't just save my home. I saved the only part of Julian that still had a chance to grow. I forced him to land in the dirt so he could finally stop falling through the clouds. The lesson of the 99-year lease agreement is one that the modern world, with its obsession for speed, often forgets. The law protects the far-sighted. While the vultures look at the next 20 minutes, the architect looks at the next 20 years. Documentation is destiny. In a world of digital dust, the paper that is recorded in the physical registry is the only thing that holds the roof up when the market rains. Dignity is a non-transferable asset. You cannot sell someone's history without becoming a ghost yourself. The law always protects those who are far-sighted, and it is a patient spider that weaves a web of protection for those who understand that truth is the only immutable blockchain. The final foundation. I am 65 years old, and according to my prepaid lease, I have 80 years of peaceful enjoyment left in this house. By the time this lease expires in 2010-5, I will be long gone, but the ancestry of law I leave behind will still be standing. I have restructured my will so that Aegis Holdings, LLC, will pass to a land trust dedicated to preserving archaic homes for those who actually intend to live in them. Julian visited last Sunday. He didn't come to leverage anything. He came to help me prune the roses. As we stood in the garden, his hand stained with the same soil that once humiliated him, he looked up at the house. "It really is a beautiful structure, Mom," he said, his voice finally carrying the quiet wisdom I thought he'd lost. "It's not just a structure, Julian," I replied, handing him the shears. "It's a covenant, and as long as you respect the ground you stand on, the ground will hold you up. The digital mirage has moved on to other targets, other spatial assets, owned by people who haven't read their fine print. But here in the suburbs of Connecticut, the ghost of sacrifice has retired. In her place sits a woman who poured the concrete, read the lease, and realized that the most sublime victory is simply refusing to let the world move you when you are already exactly where you belong. The sun has set now. The house is warm. The furnace is humming its rhythmic iron heartbeat, and I am exactly where the law says I should be. I am Eleanor Sullivan. I am the landlord of my own soul. And I'm not moving an inch, meaning when the world tries to trade your life for liquidity, remember that the law and your dignity always protects those who have the courage to be far-sighted. Build your foundation deep. Read every word of the covenant. And never let a smart key tell you that you don't own the ground beneath your feet.